From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Beth Yeager and Terry Griffin will share highlights from a presentation they prepared for an upcoming symposium hosted by the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. They've pulled together information on how agricultural technology and the use of data will affect agricultural productivity growth in the future. Then Terry will stick around to tell us about a new farm management decision tool from K-State that's built around historic farmland values. He says this can be useful in an assortment of ways. And further ahead, this week's wildlife management segment where K-State's Charlie Lee will talk about what's behind the increasing number of black bear sightings in Kansas. All this and more here on Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
While the CDC urges you to avoid close contact, like hugging or shaking hands, there are other non-physical ways to say hello. Wave, wink, use sign language, salute, smile, give the peace sign, throw up an air high five, do jazz hands. Remember, stay a minimum of 6 feet or 2 arms length away from others and stay home if you can. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. As always, glad to have you along. And what we'll do during the first segment of today's program is actually give you a preview of what is shaping up to be a major informative event taking place in the month of May online. It'll be hosted by the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. It's a symposium, and we'll get into the nuance of this as we talk with a couple of our guests who will be contributing to the program. They're from the Agricultural Economics Department at K-State. Terry Griffin and Beth Yeager have joined us now. They will actually be addressing the role of technology and data as the symposium, Terry, is going to get into the roots of agricultural productivity growth. Tell us about this program and its significance, if you would.
We originally planned to be at the 2020 Ag Symposium, but unfortunately it was postponed until 2021 when it became a virtual event. And I would like to let our listeners know that the event is free. Registration is free, but it is required. And there's a group of papers that will be presented. Beth and I, along with our co-author, Lavana Trawick, who many of our listeners will remember as a guest on your show, put together a paper at the request of the Federal Reserve Bank based upon our other work. And we're going to present to ag lenders and leaders in the agricultural community, along with other scientists and researchers across the country. But it's all about productivity growth and where we expect agriculture to be in the future. And many of our listeners may remember Beth and I have been chatting about ag technology, but not only that, but the differences between how baby boomers and millennials are adopting and utilizing that technology. So that's going to be our slant on this Ag Symposium is today, baby boomers and Generation X are the majority of farm operators in Kansas, but in the future that will change. And we give our prediction and forecast for how the agricultural industry, ag lenders, and service providers will need to cater and reach millennials and Generation Z.
This symposium taking place virtually Monday, May the 24th, Tuesday, May the 25th, hosted by the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City once more. Let's then mine down into the items that you'll be covering, Terry, as a presenter, and that you, Beth, have helped Terry accumulate on the future prospects of agricultural productivity growth and how the use of data can contribute to that. You've discussed this with us before about the generational differences in technology adoption, but you say you have 5 talking points that you've come up with to weave into this presentation. Share those with us, if you would.
We do, Eric. So what we did was we came up with what are the 5 main themes that we really want to take away. And each of the sessions will have both a discussant and a panelist or 2 panelists along with a moderator. And so we wanted to make sure in our session that we really focused on some of the key takeaways or key findings of our work. And so one of those is that the median age of our farm operators is increasing. That's also at a similar rate as the life expectancy of all Americans. So we're continuing to see the farm operators, their age increase and maybe pushing back when their retirement may occur. We have multiple generation farms are utilizing more technology than the sole proprietor farms. And there's a number of reasons that may be the case, but a lot of our multiple generation farms do have millennials or other generations that are coming back and joining those baby boomers or possibly the silent generation. And so that's making differences in terms of how decisions are maybe being made. There may be some higher net farm income on those farms as well, because they likely are supporting more individuals. And then our third talking point is after several decades after commercialization of these technologies, many of the ag technologies we're finding are still in the early adopter stage. So there's still quite a bit of adoption that could occur. Fourth, we have that the majority of farms operated by baby boomers currently. However, we know that millennials will take majority at some point. We've graphed out where our operator numbers are, and it does appear like the millennials will be taking the majority. We don't know when that's going to occur, but when it does, they will conduct business very differently. And looking at already, they have a large technology utilization and adoption, and so looking at how that will continue over time and their reliance and relationship with service providers. And then our fifth talking point was that as small data are being more commonly used within the farm gate, big data has attracted considerable venture capital into agriculture, and so how that might continue on. So those are the main things that we're really hoping that our discussant takes some time to consider and that we're able to generate a good discussion with the panelists in our group as well.
There's a lot going on within those five then, to be sure. So part of the task here is to forecast how vendors, others who provide technology, can reach those target consumers of the technology. As the two of you look at those points, what do they say about that very outlook? Beth?
So that's a great question and a great point to bring up. For me, I think there's a lot of opportunities for the vendors to look at, but I think the way that they've gone to market in the past may need to be reconsidered, thinking about the value that's important for the younger generations, and that the relationship piece is maybe no longer as important as it has been for the baby boomers and the silent generation, and trying to work through, okay, what will they find attractive, and what do we really need to share as a message in terms of, if we do have a group of ag technologies that are still in the early adopter stage, finding out more why we're still in that early adopter stage and why we haven't seen a larger adoption over our farms.
Terry?
One of the things that LaVonna likes to challenge me on is we, in university setting, especially extension, have relied upon disseminating research-based information throughout our existence. She challenges me to think about how can we extend that such that we are influencers for the younger generations of Generation Z and millennials, because in popular culture, research suggests that those generations are more likely to use Yelp ratings and reviews of their peers and cohorts than they would consumer reports. And in agriculture, that would translate into, well, consumer reports is research-based information, much like university and extension programming. And so how do we in extension and the university become influencers when it comes to promoting our own research-based information?
We don't have a lot of time to spend on each of the five, but do want to bring out one specifically because it seems to jump off the page. Many technologies are still in the early adoption phase, and that's very technology specific, presumably here. What's the difference maker with those technologies? Can you boil that out in any way?
Sure. Now, the only technology on our list that has gone beyond early adopters into the early majority is automated guidance. And it differs from the others because it removes the necessity for human capital and expertise on making parallel passes to the field. It's replaced human capital with and algorithms become more automated, whereas yield monitors and variable rate fertility and seeding all require greater human capital to make use of data technology. So, yes, we're seeing automated technologies become more used than data technologies.
Will that change? Beth, any thoughts?
I think this is speculation, but in terms of my work with students, I think that as we have more of our students going through obtaining their college education, we have a lot of students who are really interested in precision ag, and a lot of students who are working in both ag econ and agronomy in this area and really focused on the technology aspect, that I think we will see a larger demand for that type of technology and for more use. But again, that's purely speculation at this point. We don't have the data to back that.
Well, this presentation that will take place as part of this symposium ought to create some momentum toward a full-fledged discussion on all these important matters as far as agricultural productivity's outlook and how data will contribute to that outlook. Again, this will be part of the session being hosted by the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, the 2021 Agricultural Symposium, The Roots of Agricultural Productivity Growth, Monday, May the 24th through Tuesday, May the 25th. You can go to kansascityfed.org to see more about participating in this symposium. Thanks to the both of you for telling us what you'll be sharing at the symposium. We appreciate the input on this always interesting topic.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.
And they are agricultural economists at K-State, both very well steeped in precision agricultural economics, Beth Yeager and Terry Griffin. But we'll have Terry back after the break. Terry is going to share some information with us on a tool on the agmanager.info website that would be very important for those of you working through matters concerning farmland values. More on that next here on Agriculture Today.
When a thunderstorm approaches, follow these safety tips. Lightning, known as the underrated killer, usually strikes the tallest objects, so avoid standing beneath trees or other isolated tall objects. Take shelter in a sturdy building. Remember, if you're close enough to hear thunder, you're close enough to be struck by lightning. Help keep you and your family safe this severe weather season. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
Agriculture Today continues now, and we've retained one of the guests from our earlier segment to talk about another tool available to you producers as you look at farmland values and want to know more about how those values actually break out for your operation for a variety of purposes. Terry Griffin with us once more, precision agricultural economist, K-State Research and Extension. Terry, this is now available on the agmanager.info website. Explain what this tool is in very basic terms, if you would.
Sure. So if you go to the Ag Manager website and click on Farm Management, and then under Land, Buying, and Valuing, there is a new tool. We went public a few months ago, but we're just now getting done beta testing it. It is really useful for looking at historic farmland values, or more particular, it's using historic farmland values for a range of farm management decision-making purposes. So if we go to the website and look at it, there's a description that kind of gives us some narrative about what it does and links to different fact sheets we have at KSRE and on Ag Manager. The second tab on the left is a time series plot. It plots the farmland value for Kansas against the United States going back to 1950. But it's not just Kansas. It defaults to Kansas, obviously, but there's a drop-down list for all of the lower 48 states, the states that had data. So our Nebraska listeners can click on Nebraska. If we have listeners in Missouri or Iowa, or if you're interested in looking at Illinois, all the states are here, all the lower 48 states, and it compares that state against the U.S. average. The next two tabs are calculators. We get some questions once in a while about, if we know the value of farmland at some point in history since 1950, can we get an estimate on the value at another year? Mm-hmm. And that's what that third tab does. But most of those questions are really about stepped-up bases and trying to estimate the potential tax liability from inherited farmland. And that tab is called Calculate Estimated Stepped-Up Bases. And this is where I think most of our listeners would use. And I've gotten several calls and emails over the last several weeks. Robin Reed and our department does as well. And I think that has something to do with individuals preparing their tax returns. And so under this tab, there's disclaimers and description on what's happening, as well as an example. If you get really interested in doing the math, you can kind of see how we did the arithmetic. But the cool part is you just plug in your numbers. And again, you can choose your state. It defaults to Kansas. You need to plug in your inheritance year. And so we had one the other day for someone inherited farmland in 1990, but they sold it this year. Had a, appraisal or a sale for the year 2020. And I think the value was $2,400, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. And using that criteria for Kansas, we would expect that the farmland was valued at about $568 in 1990. And the difference, in this case, $1,832, would be what the potential tax liability would be estimated as. And so this is a tool that not only landowners and farmers, but also I'm getting calls from tax accountants and ag attorneys and so forth. And it's not just for Kansas. We intended for this to be a national model. The next tab down below that, underneath stepped-up basis, is a map. And the cool thing is you can see all the lower 48 states at the same time. It defaults to 1974. But to get the colors showing up, for some reason, you need to take that slider bar and move it to a different year. It goes from 1950 to 2020. And I couldn't decide on what color scheme I wanted to use for the map. And so I allowed the user to choose the color scheme, whether they want to get greens or purples or a spectrum of colors. And I couldn't really decide if there was some colorblind issues I was trying to work around. And it's interactive, so you can hover the mouse over the map and actually see the values for each of the states one at a time. And for those of you who are really interested in data, the final tab on the left is Download Data. So you can download the data that we're using here to bring into your spreadsheets to do your own calculations. But the data does come from USDA, National Ag Statistics Service, which we have a link to on the first tab. So it's just recycling. I'm bringing the data in from USDA, and I'm allowing the user to download it for their own purposes as well. So this is a tool that I'm hoping gets a lot of use in Kansas as well as lower 48 states. Farmers, landowners, tax accountants, agricultural attorneys, all of the above would have an interest in using this tool.
The utility of all of these functions is very, very strong here, Terry. How localized is the data on which this is based in? In other words, we do see differences in farmland values, even similar types but different reaches of the state. How much of the local flavor is included in this?
There's not a lot of local flavor to this. So for Kansas, for instance, it's for the entire state, and it's for the data that USDA reports for the whole state. And that's true for all the other 47 lower states as well. Robin Reed and I have been talking about bringing in other types of data. So the data that we're using here is ag land, including buildings, asset value. And the reason we use this particular one from USDA is that it goes back the furthest. It goes back actually to the 1800s, although we're cutting it off at 1950. The other types of data for pasture, irrigated cropland, non-irrigated cropland, only go back to the mid-90s. And so that's been a little problematic since we're trying to use this for an inheritance tool, because a lot of the land was inherited before then. But I will say it this way, since this model, the mathematics underneath it is using percent changes, the percent change for irrigated cropland, pasture, all land, including buildings, are somewhat similar, especially in Kansas. So to use this to estimate the change in value of that land has been pretty pretty close to what we'd expect. But we are going to add another tab. And as always, suggestions are appreciated to improve our tools. So Robin and I have been chatting about creating some charts and graphs for pasture and irrigated cropland. But maybe not only that, but maybe have a field that, let's say it's a 40-acre field or a quarter section, and part of it's irrigated, part of it's not, or you may have a larger tract that has pasture land on it. So we can allocate different proportions to each of those different types of farmland to get a weighted average. So that's something we're playing with for the next enhancement that we'd like to add.
Excellent. This basic information that you have now can still answer important questions that producers might have on their minds, and especially what you got out there with stepped-up basis in land transactions, which is very much a critical component of those transactions for producers and others involved in the movement of those pieces of land. And one thing you do press in your write-up, the narrative for this tool, none of this is intended to substitute for formal land appraisals. That's still highly valuable, you say, Terry.
Definitely. Let's consider this a tool for educational purposes only. I do advise people to see the professionals, the tax attorneys, tax accountants, appraisers, rural appraisers, ag lenders. But this is a good tool for making an estimate of those potential values.
And it's live and available to producers now. Again, it's very simple to access, Terry.
It is. So everybody, I hope, is familiar with our agmanager.info website. Go to Ag Manager and click on the Farm Management tab. And then underneath Farm Management, click on Land Buying and Valuing. And this should be at the top of the list. It's an interactive dashboard. And like you said, it's available to anybody anywhere in the world, and it has data for the lower 48 states.
Very intuitive, very easy to utilize. Again, it's entitled Using Historic Farmland Values for Farm Management Decision Making, based on USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service data going back to as far back as 1950. And take a look at this, see if it can be of use to you, producers, and many others interested in those farmland values. It's available now at agmanager.info. We've covered quite some territory in our visit here today, Terry. Thanks, and we'll catch up with you again quite soon.
Sure thing, Eric. Look forward to our next gathering.
He is a precision agricultural economist with K-State Research and Extension, is Terry Griffin. He's been along with us during this first half of Agriculture Today. As a quick footnote, Terry has just posted something else brand new on the Ag Manager site. He has put together a precision agriculture technology timeline, a chronicle of the evolution, if you will, of precision tech. It's an interesting graphic. You might want to take a look at that. Now this break. When we return, today's agricultural news headlines, along with this week's edition of Milk Lines from K-State's Mike Brook and the weekly wildlife management feature with K-State's Charlie Lee. All of that is still to come here on the K-State Radio Network. Please stay with us.
With the shortage of primary care physicians, especially in rural areas, health education and disease prevention are vital. K-State Research and Extension programs address quality of life, personal development, and health behaviors across all life stages of all social economic groups. To learn more about health education, one of K-State Research and Extension's 5 grand challenges, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
This is the K-State Radio Network, and you're tuned into Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. In the agricultural news today, the weekly crop progress and condition report for Kansas from the USDA. And for the week ending this past Sunday, our topsoil moisture supplies, 5% surplus and 77% adequate, only 18% short to very short. Subsoil at 4% surplus moisture, 72% adequate, and 24% short to very short. As for the winter wheat crop, the latest condition rating, 54% good to excellent in the state, 29% fair, 17% at poor to very poor. Winter wheat now jointing is at 10%. That's considerably behind the 22% for the 5-year average on this date. And corn planting has commenced in Kansas, 2% complete. That's very near the 3% average for the date. Now, the condition of the nation's winter wheat crop has improved, while the pace of corn planting nationally is on par with the 5-year average and last year. More on that from the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
USDA has its first winter wheat condition report of the season.
Looking at that, we see, first of all, that a bit of a rarity for winter wheat, and that is that overall national conditions improved over the winter. That is somewhat unusual in that we often see conditions declining between late November and early April. But this year we saw an improvement in overall condition.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey says as this crop went into dormancy last fall,
we saw the crop was rated 46% good to excellent. The number today, 53% good to excellent. So a nice jump in the good to excellent ratings. And we saw a corresponding decrease in the very poor to poor ratings since last fall.
Even with that improvement,
that is still the lowest rated winter wheat crop that we've seen since the spring of 2018, 3 years ago.
The lowest winter wheat condition ratings are in Colorado and Texas. Rippey has the first look at corn planting.
Among the 18 major production states, we see some planting progress in 5 of them at this early stage. For the week ending April 4th, Texas, of course, leads the way, 55% of the intended corn acreage planted. That is ahead of the 5-year average of 53% and pretty much on par with last year's number of 56%.
The other states reporting corn planting progress include Kansas, Missouri, North Carolina, and Tennessee.
Nationally, we see 2% of the corn planted by April 4th. That is right on par with the 5-year average and last year's number. So nothing unusual in the early reports for corn planting.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
On the agricultural calendar this week, the Great Bend Farm, Ranch, and Hemp Expo is set to get going tomorrow on the 7th through Friday the 9th, and a trio of K-State specialists will be on board each of the noon hours over those 3 days to share information for you producers. Tomorrow the 7th at noon, K-State's Romulo Lolato will have a wheat update for you. Then at noon on April the 8th, Thursday, Jason Griffin of K-State with an update on hemp production research for Kansas. And then on the noon hour on the 9th, Friday, K-State's Anthony Zukoff on an alfalfa weevil and alfalfa insect in general update. That's on the 9th. And if you'd like to know more information, you can contact the Extension Office there in Barton County for more details. These presentations at the Great Bend Farm and Ranch and Hemp Expo this week. On we go now to this week's edition of Milk Lines with K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I'd like to talk to our Kansas dairy farmers about fly control. Yes, it's that time of year again, and in fact, maybe on your dairy you've actually noticed a few flies already with some of the warm temperatures we've had. If you're working on your fly control program for the summer, which you should be, actually it should be in force already, here are some things that you need to think about. First, you need to think about what you're doing to try to reduce fly breeding areas. So on the dairy farm, our primary fly breeding areas will be things like manure storage, spoiled feeds, and any other place where we have vegetation or other things that might remain wet and provide a breeding ground for these flies. So trying to eliminate as much of that as possible is very important. You know, when we think about manure and manure storage, if the manure is less than 30% moisture, it's really not attractive for flies as a breeding ground. So if we do have stored manure and it's dry, there's really not a problem with that as long as it stays dry. However, if rain can wet the surface or if other water can get to that pile of dried manure solids and bring that moisture content up, it can become a fly breeding ground again. As we think about managing water around the dairy, that includes runoff water off of roofs, so standing water or areas that stay wet, again, can become a fly breeding ground during the summertime. Grass growing along buildings and around the farm site can be a breeding ground, especially for things like stable flies, as they tend to move away from the farm structures and into the grass at night. It's also a primary area where they might also breed. So trying to eliminate those sources is very important. Now, once you've done all of these things, now it's time to think about whether or not we want to use an insecticide or some other form of control, such as biological control. Here's the deal. You have to start early. So if you were planning on using a larvicide this year in your animal's feed, you need to have probably already started that. If not, it needs to start very soon. And this should include all the animals on the farm, including calves, if we want to have an effective system. Second, if you're going to use some of the parasitic wasp or those sorts of biological control methods, again, you need to start those early and increase those during the season. There may come a point in time where we have to discontinue that and go to an insecticide to effectively control the flies that we're seeing. So when we think about insecticides, what are some things that you should think about? Well, number one, you should think about a premise control. That'll take care of the things like house flies to a large extent. And you should also think about things that you can spray directly onto the animals. Some of these flies do not land on the surfaces of the building. They only land on the animals. And the number one culprit we have there would be the stable flies. You know, it doesn't take very many stable flies per leg to cause a problem. In some studies that have done lost milk production, if you have 10 stable flies per front leg, so 20 total on the animal, you could see as much as a 20% loss in milk production as a result of that. So these flies cost us a lot of money every year, and they also cause animals to bunch generally in the center of the barn or in areas where they can get some breeze on them. So if you're having trouble with stable flies, probably going to have to spray the animals directly. That's really the only way to get insecticide where the flies actually they're at. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to begin planning their fly control program for the summer.
Thanks, Mike. And this is Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so stay a minimum of 6 feet away from others and stay home if you can. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Coming your way now on Agriculture Today, this week's visit with Charlie Lee, former wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension. He's along each week to talk wildlife management with us. The question this week, Charlie, black bears in Kansas, they're not as rare as one might think.
Yes, black bears or sightings of black bears are increasing in Kansas. It's certainly somewhat unusual, but not unexpected here in Kansas. When you look at the historic records, Kansas has had a black bear population, was probably extirpated out in the 1880s or so. Now, bears have moved back in the state occasionally. We have sightings almost all the way across Kansas from corner to corner. There are sightings in Morton, Meade, Chautauqua, Cherokee, Doniphan, Greeley, as well as other locations within the state. They're probably not bears that are staying here for long periods of time. They may be young male bears that have been moved out, but certainly last summer there were a couple of bears that were in Kansas for more than a month at a time, which is probably the longest stay that we've had of black bears.
So they've been roaming around, at least entering the state and then leaving it. But how are they here and where are they originating from?
Well, most likely they are from the population that was relocated from Minnesota and Manitoba into the Arkansas mountains in the 1950s, 1960s. That black bear population slowly increased, and then more recent times, they started moving into eastern Oklahoma and on up into the southern part of Missouri. Biologists in Oklahoma estimate they may have as many as 2,000 bears, most of them located in the southeastern part of the state. And even with a regulated hunting season, that population is still growing at about 6% annually. The population in Missouri has been estimated between 550 and 850 bears, probably due to, again, the Arkansas bear population expanding their range. I would expect that's the source of these animals that we see occasionally in Kansas, although we also have bears in Colorado and in New Mexico that may be the source population for some of those in the more western parts of Kansas.
But their range may be somewhat notable if they are in fact moving from Oklahoma, Missouri, New Mexico into various parts of Kansas.
Yes, and I suspect that range expansion is largely due to similar habitat conditions and perhaps an increase in the amount of woodland cover that we have here in the state. That's been a problem for many rangeland managers for many years. As tree cover increases, habitat conditions change, and wildlife species respond to those changes.
Let's talk about the black bear's preferred habitat, that cover you mentioned. What else do they need to sustain?
Well, looking at a study that was just recently published in the Journal of Wildlife Management on the Oklahoma bear population, they tried to determine the resources that the recolonizing black bears were utilizing. So they live captured bears, fitted them with GPS collars, followed them from 2011, I think, until 2016, and then are gradually writing up a lot of the information that they collected. They found through that time frame that black bears, particularly selected for moist oak and riparian forest types. The riparian forests were selected by black bears more in the northern populations, and the land cover type is often attributed to high food availability and the cover that's provided by that hard and soft mass-producing plant species, which would be acorns and things like cherries further south, blackberries further north. They determined that the deciduous woodland and forest areas that contained 1.5 times more percent of cover of soft mass-producing species than evergreen and mixed forest types. There was almost 6 times more percent cover of soft mass-producing species than pasture prairie cover types, but only 1 times higher percent cover than human modified habitat cover types.
You mentioned, though, the mast, the berries. Can they survive on just those food resources, or do they need more as carnivores?
Well, they're carnivores, but they're largely opportunistic feeders. The majority of the diet of black bear is vegetable matter. Grasses, fruits, apples, grapes, strawberries, persimmons, cherries, blackberries, nuts make up over 90% of their diet. Animal matter is consumed by black bears, things like insects, small rodents, birds, and carrion. In my tenure as a wildlife specialist, I had several people call and thought that perhaps they had animals that were killed by bears, but I had never found any that I could say with any degree of certainty that a black bear damaged livestock in Kansas. I think if it would be a very rare situation, because it is rare in other states where they have a much higher density of black bears than we probably ever will here in Kansas.
And further, you say that they're not too keen about being around humans anyway, particularly humans in large numbers.
Now, in this particular study, they found that they selected for areas further away for humans, selected for more rugged terrain, and areas that were not modified by human activities. So I think there will be times that we have bear-human conflicts because those have already occurred in isolated areas in Kansas, as well as occur frequently in other states with a higher density of bears. I think it's something that still should be enjoyed and appreciated, but realize at some point in time we may have to deal with the damage that bears can cause.
You can think of them right now as maybe the occasional novelty, but they are, in fact, crossing into our state every once in a while here in Kansas. That is the black bear. Charlie, thanks for the background on that. He's a former wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Charlie Lee, along with us each Tuesday. And our time is away once again. By the way, for a replay of today's broadcast, or for any previous broadcast, going back several months, in fact, go to agtoday.net You can learn about the automatic download service right there as well at agtoday.net. In the meantime, please be back with us right here tomorrow. Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.